Hello everyone, this is Fideda, the colorful social theory renegade that you're seeing right now in the video. Thank you for being here. I like creating material in defense of the common people, and I wanted this video to be the most comprehensive multimedia exposure of the dangerous and unsolvable contradictions in Peterson's socioeconomic vision of the world. It is my honor to show you that Peterson seems to blast a full-volume anthem about a better world. And in reality, all he does is to simply whisper a lullaby to put you to sleep. This is the first of a series of episodes in which I'm going to show you that Jordan Peterson invites you not to question the socioeconomic contradictions of capitalism. I'm also going to show you that Peterson is a successful master of many subtle arts, most notably the art of strawmanship, which means misrepresenting an opponent's position to better attack it, or to unfairly make it appear as unreliable, dangerous, or false. As we shall see, Peterson uses a strawman argument when he discusses, for example, white privilege. More curiously, Peterson is also a master of the subtle art of disguise. If you want to know why, just wait until I show you how many agendas Peterson disguises as safe, productive, and cool, while in reality they are the most dangerous and elite-friendly excuses that you will ever remember after watching this video. In this video, you will realize that the incoherence of many ideas of Jordan Peterson have tremendously bizarre and impactful implications in real life, if taken to heart. In fact, well hidden beneath Peterson's serious-sounding ideas lie problematic, low-quality, and business-friendly political messages. Let's see why. Let's start from the credibility issue before discussing Peterson's political messages. Peterson leaves traces of some shocking contradictions and blatant simplifications that raise serious concerns, especially over his mostly self-reported credibility. For instance, in the PragerU video called "Dangerous People Are Teaching Your Kids," Peterson warns us over apparently terrible identity groups warring for power, just to mention one hilarious thing. However, reportedly, Peterson launches his warning from a YouTube channel called PragerU, which received millions in fundings from pro-free market billionaires of the powerful fossil fuel industry. PragerU is a channel alleging that fossil fuel is the greenest energy, justifying the infamous Iraq War, putting violent British colonialism in a good light, calling for no welfare state, and also staunchly defending US Republicans. Anyway, I'm not trying to use the guilty by association fallacy, as in I see a picture of Peterson appearing physically close to a bad person and I automatically say, oh, Peterson is bad. I'm not silly. Here it's different though, and much more problematic. Jordan Peterson apparently features in almost 10 PragerU videos. Apparently, he was even the speaker at one PragerU summit. Now, all this Jordan Peterson in around, undoubtedly, makes the socioeconomically dangerous pro-multinational ideas of PragerU gain views and reputation, especially thanks to Peterson's huge followership. Having said that, apparently, the surface link is far more direct here. In fact, by providing PragerU with content, presentation skills, and views, Jordan Peterson evidently offers collaboration to the pro-war and market fundamentalist enthusiasts of the climate-altering fossil fuel industry, which is, by the way, quite in love with lobbying and its anti-democratic effects. And just to use a Peterson-style expression, that isn't good. Between 2019 and 2020, the fossil fuel industry paid millions of dollars to US Republicans, as the NGO Open Secrets revealed. And guess what? Republicans and multi-million-dollar capitalism are apparently put in a nice light by the same PragerU channel that showcases Peterson's ideas. In fact, PragerU made hyper-simplistic videos insisting on the Republicans' anti-slavery past, while totally ignoring that at a certain point in history, Republicans simply changed. With the post-Reconstruction rise of the racist Lily White movement, for example, says The Atlantic, the Republican Party apparently made conscious decisions to court the white vote at the expense of the black vote. So PragerU is fooling around with you. And since we are talking about fluff, I will show you that Peterson's ideology and communicative strategies have a lot in common with the style of PragerU, which uses terrible omissions, simplifications, and generalizations. But let's go deeper into the matter. To make it understandable to the Marxists, Peterson sounds like the spokesperson of the ruling class, for many reasons I'm going to show. To make it understandable to Peterson's fans, Peterson promises a first-class limousine trip for anyone willing to strive for success in life. In reality, what Peterson hides from fans is a third-class trip in a cargo hold for the opportunity-less majority. So let's start from Peterson's subtle political messages, which betray a lot of anti-common people concepts. To my knowledge, few have noticed that a lot of Peterson's audiovisual material can be mostly deconstructed and demystified with the following political message. Be grateful to capitalist society. Don't bother stressing about historical inequalities or specific dysfunctions inherent to the capitalist system. And go back to your studies or to work. A little more. Perhaps thank you for watching. Now, the critical mind asks, how can we make a better society? Peterson replies, do you want Pepsi or Coke? While the critical mind worries about the social and ecological impacts of capitalism, Peterson often calls for capitalist optimism uncritically with gratitude-coded messages such as this. And yet the picture in capitalism is much more complicated than how Peterson usually simplifies it. Just a quick look at some mainstream articles can show you how terribly problematic capitalism often turns out to be, and how much Peterson's verbiage fails to address the inherent issues of capitalism. In fact, you don't hear specific dynamics from Peterson at all. Here are few titles retrievable online just to get an idea on the terrible impacts of private activities in the world. And of course, I don't even think there's any need to comment here. We got alleged stories on never-ending pollution by the oil industry in Nigeria, spying on critics of pesticides, financing climate change denial with billions of dollars, companies fined for anti-consumer cartels and anti-competitive practices, private deforestation, terrible allegations related to mining in Congo and elsewhere, tax evasion, the largest marine oil spill in history, asbestos in company products, poor work conditions in supply chain, occupational health issues, fraud, money laundering, dams collapsing, and whatnot. Peterson makes short work of all the daily impacts of private companies, and even of the more occasional private catastrophes. But let's get to three specific political messages implied by most of Peterson's ideas. These anti-people messages keep resurfacing over and over in videos where Peterson features. There's a bit of a crossover here. Stay with me. The first message implied by Peterson's ideology is the following. Promote equalization of opportunities and don't let state or organized action radically disturb the markets in general. In brief, do not conduct any organized social action to radically alter the functioning of supply and demand in general, even within the framework of traditional capitalist politics. Under normal circumstances, if one really wants to intervene, according to Peterson, one should equalize opportunities. Apparently, an equalization method is to work hard with self-development tools to obtain more opportunities, which is a very vague and bizarre proposition in capitalism, as we shall see. However, says Peterson, do not equalize different pays using Scandinavia-style social democratic legislation or any other organized action. Now, the term opportunities is very vague and may refer to multiple economic variables, which have to be stressed if we want to be clear on what we're talking about. Anyway, even if we identify a variable, for example, a specific tool or some form of human capital to get a higher salary, this hyper-general variable remains tough to study and cannot be precisely evaluated in relation to anything potential. For instance, we will never know the maximum potential of a person in capitalism, or in any other system for that matter, so it's a bit rich to say I am equalizing his or her or their opportunities. One wonders at this point, in relation to what and how can we verify this? Anyway, I am not saying that it's pointless to talk about equalizing opportunities, but it can only give us a very general direction. In fact, talking about opportunities is simply not enough to reassure attention-paying people of anything. For obvious reasons, the whole approach revolving around equalizing opportunities sounds hypocritical. It fails, for example, to give a propertyless poor chap any concrete tools against the immense market power of corporate giants, especially when these giants started accumulating wealth decades and decades before a poor chap. For instance, some Peterson-style self-development sessions may even put a poor chap in a position where he or she or they have relatively more opportunities to find a job than before, assuming that the poor chap is coached on how to find employment more efficiently somehow. However, if meantime you haven't regulated the labor market, but have allowed a century-old money-multiplying multinational to keep providing poor chaps with exclusively low-wage employment, you have done little. The poor chap remains a poor chap, and the multinational keeps scoring millions of dollars through its enormous market power. That's the industrialist's paradise, Charles Dickens' 19th century Britain. Similarly, take a poor chap who inherited no wealth and never accessed any quality education. You have helped this poor chap gain comparatively better opportunities than before, assume. Meantime, you have allowed a business-owning person to inherit an additional fortune and build 3 money-multiplying factories. Well, you have done little. You just remain in Peterson's unequal world of political indifference, a world where those who did not inherit any family wealth or inherited little are ignored and will always remain at the mercy of historical unfairness. Take another case. You have waved the flag of equal opportunities, but have allowed a propertyless poor chap, for example, to pay a skyrocketing rent. Also, you haven't taken any state action against the market power of few house-owning families in a city. Also, in this case, you have done little. Now, the list of cases is really long. I could go on forever, but I think the point is clear for anyone that wants to see clear. The paradox in Peterson's ideology is that to promote equal opportunities, you need at least a considerable degree of equalization of outcomes. In fact, there is no equalization of opportunities without a considerable equalization of wealth. Even assuming that we respect an equal individual endowment, which is another complex topic. In brief, to equalize opportunities, society will have to equalize the market power of each person, which will always be unequal until we legitimize the ownership of private production. If you don't equalize ownership in general, I would say, by making ownership cooperative and monitorable, how are you going to see the full and unhindered realization of each person's unique abilities? How can a skilled rent-paying propertyless person compete with a wealthy and skilled person that simply needs a couple of clicks to buy even a fairly small economic activity and multiply their earnings. A real equalization of opportunities implies the abolition of historical inequalities, which sounds a bit scary, I get it, to many people, because the only apparent solution would be 20th century communism. But I have a very pragmatic, non-violent, and immediately applicable alternative to 20th century communism called Retism, Retism. I'm going to talk about it later, perhaps in a second part. Now, let's conclude about the first apparent political message in Peterson's ideology. Paradoxically, by calling for an equalization of opportunities, Peterson implicitly invites us to equalize outcomes, which is quite funny because it looks like Peterson doesn't know, or he doesn't want to know, or he doesn't want to tell you. History knows what Peterson's intentions are. Without any equalization of outcomes, you abandon people to the vice of historical inequalities. And the unethical point of Peterson's approach is all the more evident when we realize the origin of historical inequalities. And these historical inequalities impact innocent individuals. In fact, historical inequalities may originate also from very problematic elements such as injustice, unequal saving patterns, unequal distribution of resources across countries, luck, the impacts of competition, and historical periods where now illegal practices used to be condoned and which benefited the wealthy. Peterson's inherently flawed approach fails to provide people with the ideological ability to defend themselves from the impacts of greedy pro-business politicians and business people, including those of the pro-war fossil fuel industry, apparently associated with PragerU, by the way, on which Peterson features. Now, I have additional notes on the equalization of women's outcomes. Peterson insists that equalizing women's socioeconomic situation, as Norway did, for example, is undesirable for whatever reason. He doesn't justify why it is undesirable. Neither Peterson uses any political economy tool to show why it is so. Anyway, Peterson rather prefers to tell us about a more controversial approach. For example, teaching women how to say no, how to negotiate in the highly elitist labor market, as opposed to resorting to social engineering practices such as equalizing wages or imposing pro-women quotas. According to Peterson, in fact, women are generally more agreeable than men. And being agreeable may hurt women's achievements. Now, this is extremely controversial and debatable. I will probably make a separate video on the gender wage gap and related issues if you want me to. Just message me in case. Now, let's get to the second message implied by Peterson's ideology, which is a bit more complex. Supporting the opposition between capital and wage labor. By supporting capitalism, Peterson suggests that society leave capitalism and ownership relations fundamentally untouched. Fluff aside, we are told that we should keep owners and shareholders in opposition to salaried employees, and thereby that we should maintain the historical market advantage of these owners and shareholders over more defenseless employees. The market advantage is quite obvious in the mind of the attentive political economist because owners and shareholders have the oligopoly of private job supply in capitalist society. In brief, these people are the dear moneybags who give the common people jobs for them to survive. Even assuming some perfect competition of differently skilled workers in society, which is a phantasmagoric dream, the fact that owners and shareholders own factories, outlets, plants, houses, know-how, land, and other socioeconomic tools is a huge inequality breeding advantage for them. Peterson makes short work of this. Now, these advantages give owners or shareholders a huge market power over employees. With a factory, owners and shareholders can score a profit out of employees without even working, just by sitting down. Literally, hiring someone trusted to supervise and manage the employees while letting the money flow. So, owners and shareholders keep filling their pockets just by being entitled to something. That is to say, just by owning activities. We think feudalism of the so-called titles is over, and it is, but entitlement is still there. Economic entitlement. Now, the whole liberal law revolves around protecting private property in general. This includes the private property of production, no matter how problematic the social implications of private activities are. And if these propertied people obtain their job-providing private activities through exploitation, segregation, unfair commercial practices, land grabbing, formerly legal abominations, and whatnot, their wealth accumulation game becomes even more immoral, not to mention impactful. Easily accumulating money through ownership remains problematic even if owners and shareholders obtain their job-providing activities through inheritance at a certain point in history. This can happen if business people are the heirs of ancestors that accumulated considerable wealth. In fact, the heirs of wealthy ancestors can still use the market power of their inherited wealth against the so-called poor chaps, especially when the so-called poor chaps were not lucky enough to inherit anything from their wealth-accumulated ancestors. All these conflicting dynamics were the fundamental discovery of Karl Marx and other early socialists. This discovery should be pointed out irrespective of how critical we must be of the horrors and abominations of 20th century communism, which, by the way, I do not recommend as a solution to any problem. No wonder I have my own separate theory called Retism, Retism, which I will discuss in the second part of the video. Having said that, it is still clear to most academics that it's not so easy to dismiss Marx's anti-private claim, as Peterson does, so simplistically. No wonder the ghost of Marx is still persecuting capitalist and non-capitalist economists that are still debating today Marx's legacy in political economy. And as we shall see, Peterson's dismissal and misrepresentation of Marxism are all the more counterproductive if we consider the significant possibility that we could achieve a nonviolent and efficient society exclusively without those owners and shareholders hijacking the labor market. This society is based on hard-working managers, technical figures, and employees, all part of an economic organization that prevents aristocratic ownership as well as the exploitation of owners and shareholders. Peterson makes short work of such feasible possibilities, mostly appealing to emotions and, using the strawman argument of 20th century communism continuously, which was indeed a catastrophe. We all agree that 20th century communism was maladaptive, so to speak. But linking 20th century communism to the left in general, which apparently includes all sorts of centrist people, is strawmanship at its purest. In fact, one could apply a similar strawmanship tactic to discredit capitalism, for example, by attributing reports of over 100 million deaths to capitalist sources of conflicts and suffering, which include, the First World War, the Vietnam War, the pro-capital Nazi oppression, colonial wars, the genocide of indigenous people in the Americas, and the Atlantic slave trade. However, such subtle art of strawmanship would not suffice to prove that any form of capitalism is maladaptive, just as bashing Stalinism or Leninism doesn't prove that post-capitalism is absolutely undesirable or that cooperatives are dictatorial. Did the Banque Desjardins, a cooperative structure, ever send people to Siberian gulags? We all know the answer, no. One needs to get into the matter to show how and why capitalism or anti-capitalism can be dangerous in specific situations. Still, I wholeheartedly empathize with Peterson's concerns over potential communist-style political degeneration, assuming that the concerns are genuine. But the catastrophe of 20th century communism does not imply that other democratic and nonviolent experiments, devoid of any aristocratic ownership of production, will necessarily reproduce a political catastrophe. This is a no-brainer. In fact, there are theories of large-scale societal organization that call for a legal, democratic, and majority-voted transition towards a society of cooperativism and participation. One of these experiments is, by the way, my theory called Retism, which I already mentioned, and I'm going to discuss in a while. There are also small-scale experiments of grassroots democracy that did not create any catastrophe, including co-ops, credit unions, and cooperative eco-villages, even though I'm not suggesting eco-villages as a universalistic solution to the problems of the world. By the way, it is worth noting that Peterson discusses the equity doctrine of the so-called radical left, mostly in terms of the vague outcome equalization. But the real equalization game, which is not discussed in detail by Peterson, is that of equalizing the profit-to-wage ratio in society. Now, this is usually an uncomfortable moral and economic topic for capitalists, and Peterson perfectly avoids discussing this topic in detail. Intentionally, accidentally, we will never know. Peterson basically tells you that we should be fine with rising inequalities, because wealth accumulation has over time kept people out of starvation and similar horrors. Even though Peterson doesn't specify how many centuries capitalism took to achieve this, and all the related dynamics, neither Peterson discusses how slowly capitalism is giving wealth to employees, in contrast with how fast capitalism is giving wealth to the propertied people. Even the UN recognizes this dramatic situation. Then Peterson discourages you from making any leftist attempt to redistribute wealth. How? Peterson tells you that leftism is likely, notice the likely, a crafty politician-style self-defense, to create a catastrophe. In brief, 20th century communism. Now, what's this? Is this even an argument? This is low-quality, inequality-friendly generalization. Peterson constantly misattributes the results of 20th century communism to any anti-mega profit social action, which is ridiculous. In conclusion, Peterson doesn't tell us a thing on how ownership and shareholding relations should be transformed to progressively prevent capitalism from breeding increasing inequalities in our democratic society. Peterson doesn't tell us a single thing on how capitalism inherently fosters greed, a well-reported psychological abomination. Neither Peterson tells us that the owners and shareholders can bequeath their fortunes to their relatives, who will keep the dice of ownership exploitation and inequalities rolling. But there's more Peterson doesn't tell us about. Let's get now to the third message implied by Peterson's ideology: political individualism and anti-group politics. In an April 2018 video called "Jordan Peterson Doesn't Understand Postmodernism," the video's author smartly suggests that Peterson is opposed to any group-based politics, and that such politics are simplistically categorized by Peterson as Marxist. Now, based on the video published by CAC Philosophy, we come to the conclusion that it's not quite clear whether Peterson simply lies, or he has a bias, or he misrepresents postmodernism and Marxism intentionally. However, it seems clear that if the intention of Peterson is to create a common enemy, then a successful strategy may imply bashing a strawman called postmodern Marxism. And by the way, postmodern Marxism doesn't really make any sense because postmodernism rejects overarching narratives, including the narrative of neo-Marxism. Now, Peterson's misconception of Marxism is not just misleading and false. As CAC Philosophy shows, keeping Peterson's logic in mind, even fascism could be paradoxically classified as Marxism. Also, Peterson, with a sleight of hand, subtly tells us to adopt a vague and passive form of individualism by inviting us to dump group-based agendas. In a way, Peterson tells us not to oppose the unfair practices of pro-capital groups collectively, which is quite a bizarre and investor-friendly proposition. History clearly shows how collective actions very often helped workers enjoy better labor rights, even in capitalism. It is sufficient to have a look at the history of German and Swedish social democracy to realize all this, and at the various struggles to reduce the working hours. It is naive to deny the importance of group-based politics, especially considering the desperate historical necessity behind the rise of a myriad of group agendas. Hence, subtly and silently, Peterson suggests that listeners avoid collectively opposing wealthy people that use their accumulated wealth's market power to underpay employees, or conduct reproachable governance practices, or irremediably impact the environment. And what's even more paradoxical is that Peterson makes short work of those privileged privates who don't hesitate to, implement collectivistic agendas in the name of profit. These privileged people include the financiers, owners, and entrepreneurs who meet and plan through capitalist associations and gala events, donate to political parties, staff political administrations, lobby politicians individually, create humongous mergers with other companies, and so on and so forth. And guess what? The PragerU channel itself, on which Peterson features, is a group-based attempt to influence public opinion and make you do nothing to oppose the group-based actions of the capitalist class, which meantime lobbies and staffs administration. Oh, Peterson. Peterson doesn't even tell us that all these anti-common people practices are very habitual in capitalist electoral democracies, and that they betray a lack of ethics and a considerable degree of aristocracy. It's not wise to use the simplistic logic, the system is not perfect, but it's the best we've got, because this is simply not the best we've got. With a sleight of hand, PragerU style, Peterson, the top-hatted magician, manages to hide centuries of political economy and history. With tricks worth of Houdini, Peterson hides history of political economy from the gullible, who is not going to question his claims anyway. Boom! Fireworks and magic. We are all amazed by Peterson's magic spectacle, and with this magic, Peterson gets our gullible consent. In exchange, we get a rabbit jumping away from Peterson's top hat. The hidden political messages that we discussed are more than enough to show the immense and unsolvable contradictions in Peterson's ideology, not to mention apparent issues with Peterson's political credibility. Anyway, I will go more in detail in multiple parts if necessary, covering a good range of topics, some of which are problematically faced by Peterson. With upcoming material, I will discuss important topics, including the failure of electoral democracy in capitalism and socialism, white privilege, Peterson's misconception of hierarchy, Soviet democracy, my theory of Retism, Marx's theory of immiseration, and the illusion of meritocracy, all in relation to, Peterson's verbiage. Please feel free to press like and subscribe. Also, feel free to message me if you want me to discuss specific topics, including topics related to Jordan Peterson. I hope this video was enough to convince you to become one of my patrons. If you want to be my patron and promote my work, you will find the link to my Patreon account below. Thank you for everything.